In this video, we're going to be taking a look at how we can use paint effects to help us bed geometry into our backplates. In this example, we have a very chaotic, rocky-looking landscape as a backplate, but a very smooth connection between our backplate and foreground objects. And this is where we can use paint effects to create some rocky geometry to help bed this object into the backplate. Okay. I'm going to take a look at our geometry that we've actually placed into our scene. It's relatively chaotic, although a lot smoother than the original rock. This is fine because, as I said, what we're actually going to be doing here is just creating a small piece of rough geometry that just sits around where these two objects connect. Okay, now paint effects allows us to basically draw curves onto a surface and then create tubes along those curves. I'm going to go into the rendering menu and go to my paint effects tab. Now the first thing I'm going to need to do here is make the object paintable. That will allow me to draw onto the surface. So if I just go to paint effects, make paintable, click on that. Now, as soon as that is now paintable, I can then start thinking about how I'm going to draw on the surface. Now, I'm just going to very quickly just draw straight onto the surface to show one other issue that we're going to have. If I just go to Paint Effects tool and I draw. Now, I'm not sure what brush I've got right now, but I'm just going to draw on this surface. So you can see I'm drawing a line, there we go, along that surface. Now, as soon as I let go, it calculates and you can see my brush jumps. Now the reason why the brush jumps is because it uses the surface's UV coordinates in order to place where this curve has been drawn on the surface. I'm just going to delete that. So I'll just get rid of the brush stroke. So our surface right now doesn't have any usable UV coordinates. So before we can start using paint effects, we need to UV map this object. Now for what I need, this can be very, very basic. I'm literally just going to take this object and planar map it from the top view. So create UVs and in the y-axis, planar map that object. There we go. Now I'm just going to go back to the paint effects brush just to show you. This time when I draw, let go, the object stays in place as it should have. Okay. So you can see what the paint effects brush did for us. It allowed me to draw on the surface and a sort of a cylindrical tube was made. Now, these don't have to be cylindrical tubes. We can do pretty much anything. We can paint geometry over the surface and we can have offshoots to those tubes. And we have quite a good library of ready-made objects that we can use as our paint effects brushes. So I'm just going to go to Window, General Editor's Visor. And this is going to bring up all of my paint effects brushes. Now, there are a whole load of crazy ones in here. We've got things like animal skins and snakes and clouds and arms and legs and pretty much everything. Now, remember, what we're actually trying to achieve here, I'm not really bothered about the colour of these surfaces. Whatever I paint into this, I'm not too bothered about how it's actually going to look as far as texture. What I'm more interested in is shape. So what I'm actually after is something that looks a little bit like my rock. And obviously we have a whole load of different brushes that will work for different things. I mean, I'm going to be after something which looks a little bit like rock. There are also things like we have grasses. So if you're trying to bed something into a, there we go. If you're trying to bed something into a very grassy landscape, we can use some grasses to create a very sort of grass-like effect over the top of our objects. We could even use hair, to be honest. There's a whole load of these, but as I said, we're not interested in colour, we're just interested in shape. Now, for rocky objects, one of my favourites to use, believe it or not, is in the food brushes, and I tend to use popcorn a lot. Popcorn just creates sort of very sort of chaotic, sort of bumpy looking pieces of geometry. So I'm going to use that. There we go. So I just double click that and close that down. Okay, so now when I paint onto this surface, it's going to create popcorn. Now actually I'll just draw straight on. I'm going to use a very large brush here just to show you what we get. You can see it creates all these weird chaotic looking bits of geometry. And they don't look so great when we get up close, but remember this works best for mid to background objects. It is possible to use this for foreground objects, things that are close to the camera, but it's definitely best when we use for midground or background. Okay, so you can see I've got some interesting chaotic shapes from that, but obviously they're way too big right now, so I'm going to delete the stroke. Okay, so the first thing I need to do, now I'm using the Paint Effects brush. Again, just to reiterate, to get into the Paint Effects brush, I'll go to Rendering, Paint Effects, and then Paint Effects Tool. Next thing I want to do, just make sure I've selected on my surface, go to the Paint Effects brush, there we go. Next thing I want to do is change the size of my brush. You can see that was way too big. So I'm going to hold the B key down and drag with either the left or the middle mouse button. I'm going to drag that left and right until I'm roughly, I don't know, probably something like that. I don't want these to be too big. Let's just try painting around the edge here. That's not bad. That's not a bad size for my brush. Okay, so this is in effect what we're going to be doing. I'm going to delete that a second though. Okay, so let's do this for real now. Okay, so I have my popcorn selected. I also have my brush size, the right size. I'm now going to just draw along the base. Now I'm just going to draw a straight line just along here. I might backtrack a few times, do something like that. And I might just do this side as well. So I'm just going to draw another stroke on this side. There we go. Cool. Okay, give it a second. Right, there we have it. So if we have a look through our camera, we now have some interesting rocky material in front of our camera. Now, I want to adjust this stroke. I want to adjust the strokes on this because I might want to spread the strokes out, spread the rocky material out, or I might want to make them larger or smaller. If I want control over these, right now, if I just select one of the strokes, hit Control A, I can go into my stroke menu in the attribute editor, and I can get at pretty much all of the inputs for that. I can also go to the popcorn actual brush stroke, and this is where I can get to all of the information about how this actually looks. So I can change things like global scale. I can make everything bigger, a little bit slow or smaller. And I can change, well, we'll look at a few of these in a second, but I'm just going to make that a little bit smaller. Now, you will notice when I changed this, it didn't update my other brush stroke. Now, this can be a real problem if you're using multiple objects, if you're creating maybe 100 strokes, but you don't want to obviously edit 100 of these brush strokes here. Now, one way that I can get around this is to share only one brush. To share one brush, all I need to do is first of all select the object that I want to update, and then shift select the object that I want to share the brush of. So that'll be the second popcorn. I'm now going to go up to Paint Effects and Share One Brush. Now, as soon as I do this, the two objects will now share one brush stroke. So if I adjust Popcorn 2 and I maybe change that global scale again, you'll see that both of these objects will now update together. And I can do this on as many objects as I like. Now, the other thing that I may want to do is spread my points out, spread my brush strokes out a little more. I can do this under brush profile and adjust the brush width. So if I take the brush width right up, you'll see that these strokes will spread out a lot. They get diffused around that surface. It's probably a little bit too much. And if I wanted them tighter packed, I can obviously bring the brush width down, and they're going to be very tightly packed around the curves that I drew. I'm going to probably leave it roughly where it was really. It was kind of okay. What I'm now going to do is adjust the actual size of each individual paint effect stroke. So I'm just going to go down, just close that up. I'm going to go down into my tubes menu under popcorn. Okay, and I want to go into the creation menu. This is what sets up how these tubes are actually drawn into the scene. Okay, so one thing that we can definitely say is that this is actually quite slow to work with. And remember, this is actually a background object. It's never really going to need that much detail. So right now I have 18 segments on each of these small pieces of geometry. I could probably get away with far less than that. I'm going to drop that down to 4. See, it hardly looks any different, but it should actually update a lot faster now. The other thing that I may want to do is randomize the placement of these slightly more. I can use that, I can do that by controlling the tube randomness. So this will just make them slightly more random in their placement and shape. I can also adjust the width. So if I wanted to make these smaller, or I wanted to make them longer, I can adjust from here. I'll probably keep them, maybe just make them ever so slightly smaller. So I'll bring these down just a touch. The width 1 and width 2 corresponds to the start and end of each of these tubes. You have to imagine that a paint effects brush is basically just a cylindrical tube with a start and an end. So width 1 would be, say, the start, width 2 would be the end. Obviously these objects are very flat, so we have the same width on the start and end. I can also create a little bit of randomness to the widths, and I can adjust, as I mentioned, the length as well. Now, another thing that I might want to do is have a few less of these rocks, because now I'm in danger of creating sort of too much geometry for a very small area. So I'm going to bring the tubes per step value down, and that will erode away how many tubes it actually creates. Again, this will mean that it will render a lot faster. Okay, so we've now got some random rough geometry just sort of sitting around the base of our block here. What I'm now going to want to do is ensure that it renders correctly. So in order to get our texture to match the backplate, we're going to be projecting through the camera and then projecting onto these objects. Now, in order to do that, I need to convert these objects into a mesh. This will also help us render these objects within Mental Ray. So with the object selected, with the strokes selected, I'm going to go to Modify, Convert, and I'm going to go down to, I'm going to click on the box next to Paint Effects to Polygons. Okay, now just ensure that you have quad output selected. That'll ensure that we have much cleaner geometry. And your poly limit, ideally, probably want to leave it as it is. Obviously, we don't want to create too much geometry, and that's always a danger when using paint effects and converting to polygons. But that should be plenty enough. We're not going to ever get to that amount of polygons. So I'm just going to hit Convert. Cool. Okay, so we now have our strokes. Those have been hidden, by the way. And we still have our geometry in the scene. Okay, now just want to point out that we still have history. If I wanted to go in and change maybe, I don't know, the global scale of my popcorn, maybe make it a bit bigger, you can see it all updates in real time. And you can see now everything's running a lot faster because I'm now using far less geometry. So I'm just going to get my global scale roughly where I want it. And I might just adjust a few more of these options. I'm just going to go back down to the tube creation. Maybe spread these out a little bit more. Maybe make a few less. Maybe make them a bit bigger now. Now I can see them a little bit more clearly. Something like that. Okay. Right. Okay, so we've got our geometry. It's now converted to polygons. I'm now going to create the surface that we're going to project onto this. Now, you can do this in a number of ways. We can actually use a Lambert shader to project on, and that would give us the ability to cast shadow onto this within the beauty pass. What I would normally do is use a surface shader and then composite my shadow and any occlusion into it afterwards. So I'm just going to go into my hypershade. And once in our hypershade, we're going to create a surface shader. So I'm going to go down, create a surface shader, and assign that to my popcorn objects. So I'm just going to select the actual meshes. So these are the actual meshes in the scene. I'm going to right mouse, assign material to selection. Okay. Now, once I've assigned those materials, I'm going to need to make the texture. Now, when we're projecting our backplate onto these, we're actually going to be freezing the backplate at a certain point and then using just one still image. Now, what you're going to want to do is make sure that you get the best possible image for that one frame. So if I was to shoot, if I was to project from this point here, I'd find that I have a very low resolution projection. If I get as close as I can get, maybe frame 580, that gets me pretty close. That's going to give me the maximum amount of resolution that I can get out of this. So I'm going to be projecting frame 580. So let's just go back into the surface shader. And I'm just going to click on the box next to outcolor. And I'm going to assign as projection our texture. Okay, now the projection type, because we're using the camera to project you through, will be perspective. And our camera projection attributes, I'm going to set this to link to obviously my main camera, the PF track camera that I have here. So whatever camera we're viewing from at the time, that's what we use. Now I'm just going to go into the texture itself, and as you can see, as I said, it's frame 580. So I'm going to click on image name and I'm going to find frame 580. Just wait for that to update. There we go. So let's just find frame 580. There. Cool. Okay. I'm going to turn filtering off on this. It's much better to use no filtering when we're projecting textures in this way. Otherwise we tend to get smearing on our textures. Okay, so let's just have a little look at our render. So this was the original render. I'll save that and I'll render our frame 580. So you can see straight away we have some interesting broken up edges to our surfaces. Possibly a little bit too broken up. What I may do is make the blocks a little bit bigger, and I can do that interactively very easily. So I'm just going to go back to the stroke. back to the popcorn stroke, and I'll just change the width again. Just push these up a little bit more and see how that looks. There we go. So it's a little bit less rough. Okay, so I've now broken this up and that looks great. However, at the moment, we're using the projection of that one texture from a moving camera. So as soon as I move away from 580, that projection is going to change. So if I render from this frame, we'll see the projection no longer matches. What I'm going to do is just go back to my frame 580. And I'm going to duplicate the camera on this frame. So I'm going to select the camera, hit Control D to duplicate, and I'll rename this. I'll rename this to Projection Cam. Once I've renamed it, I'm just going to go back to the surface shader that I assigned to my objects. And I'm just going to go into the projection node and make sure I'm linking not to the animated camera, but to the projection camera. So I should now, if I move the camera back again, and I render from this view, I should now get something that matches much, much better. But yeah, that's it. Thanks very much. Bye-bye.